All right, welcome back. So in this video, I actually think this is going to be the last video of the chapter. We're now going to talk about the technique for deep charging, right? So we talked about that in chapter 11, chapter 10. Chapter 10, we talked about what it means to deep charge. We pretty much went over the majority of the ideas for deep charging, but we're pretty much going to, this will almost mostly be review, but we're just going to talk about it in this video because it's actually very, very, very important, right? So basically, you can't reach the really higher levels of charging intensity without deep charging, right? That's pretty much you have to go through the deep charging process to get to the higher levels. And like I said before, you may not be used to thinking in these ways, right? But the ways that I'm teaching you, these are the principles that govern subconscious behavior outside of the condition where something's new, right? So like I said, and I know I keep saying it, but I just want to hammer that point home, right? When something's new, your subconscious and your emotions function almost in a completely different way from the way they function when something isn't new, right? When something's old, then you have to rely on these principles in the way your subconscious actually works, right? In other words, this is the rule, not the exception. So to get to the really higher levels of charge, when something's not new, you have to use these principles, specifically deep charging. So we pretty much went over it, but let's just go over this first point. So deep charging, what that basically means, right? That means increasing the amount of energy stored in your short-term subconscious memory, both in terms of positive frequencies and a frequency you wish to charge. So basically, actually, to just do a little bit of a recap beyond this, so we said that deep charging basically is when you have a short-term memory. Your short-term memory contains all of your subconscious memories that were active within the last 7 days. So you focused on some subject associated with every subconscious memory in your short-term memory in the last 7 days. They don't all have lots of energy, but they were active in the last 7 days. So because they were active in the last 7 days, at the very least, they haven't all aged out yet. So again, some of them may not have energy, but they still haven't aged out. So anything that ages out of subconscious short-term memory goes into your long-term memory and generally doesn't have any energy that affects your mood. It doesn't have a significant enough amount of energy to affect your mood or give you a charging boost when you start charging while focused on the subject associated with that memory, right? But everything in your short-term memory has enough energy, or I should say, if something has enough energy to impact your mood and for you to get a charging boost off of, then it's going to be in your short-term memory, right? So every positive memory in your short-term memory also has, on top of it having energy, it also has a frequency component, right? And so the more of that energy, so just referring to the energy very generally, in terms of the energy across all the positive memories in your short-term memory, the more all that energy reflects the frequency you are trying to charge, the more you're going to feel that in your mood, right? So your mood, you're going to feel more of that emotional intensity in the ambience of your mood, but also it's going to give you a even more intense charging boost, right, when you perform a main charging technique later. So just to go over this point here, the second point, so I say that increasing the amount of energy stored in short-term memory, both in terms of positive frequencies and a frequency you wish to charge. So what I mean by positive frequencies here is another phenomenon. So if the energy stored in your short-term memory, it gives you a charging boost if it's the same frequency you're trying to charge. So for example, let's say I'm trying to charge inner peace, right? And the total amount of energy in my short-term memory reflects the frequency of inner peace. What that means is I'm going to be in a very peaceful mood, right, throughout the day. And then when I perform the main charging technique to charge inner peace, I'm going to feel a really huge boost to my charge when I perform the main technique. So that's one parameter, or one way in which the short-term memory impacts your charge. But there's another effect too. So the frequency, that's one way in which the frequency of the energy in your short-term memory impacts your charge. But the other way it impacts your charge is just in terms of its polarity, right? Whether it's positive or negative. Because, and we talked about that before, so if you have a lot of negative frequencies in your short-term memory, that's actually going to dampen your ability to charge a positive frequency. And we'll talk a little bit more about that here. But just as an example, so if I want to charge the subconscious frequency, like I said, associated with inner peace, which is a positive frequency, if I have a lot of anger, right? If I have a lot of energy associated with anger, right, in my short-term memory, which means in the last 7 days I focused on some subject, right? And while I was focused on that subject, I produced an intention that caused my subconscious to switch to the anger frequency and then start charging up at that frequency. So I was focused on that subject, my mind entered a transcendental state. I was focused on it and held an intention for 7 to 10 seconds. My conscious mind entered a transcendental state and I started charging anger while focused on that subject, right? Now that energy that I charge will linger around in my short-term memory, and let's say I keep doing that a lot of the energy in my short-term memory will reflect the frequency of anger. What's actually going to happen is because that frequency is negative, it's going to dampen or weigh down my ability to charge the inner peace frequency, right? So it's going to make it harder. So that's very important. You want to pay attention to stuff like that, which we're actually kind of going over some of these points now, but we'll still read the points. But yeah, so now that would be different from, let's say I charge the frequency of joy, right? Let's just say I charge the frequency of joy multiple times, and my short-term memory contains a lot of energy related to the joy frequency. Well, that's still going to actually boost my ability to charge the inner peace frequency. So even though it's not the peace frequency itself, just because of the fact that it's positive, it's still going to give me a little bit of a boost, right? Now, it won't give me as much of a boost as if I just charged the peace frequency, but it'll give me still a little bit of a boost if it's a joy frequency. Like I said, just because it's positive. And that's true for any positive frequency. So whether we're talking about joy, gratitude, happiness, or laughter, right? Or love, whatever it is, if it's a positive frequency, it's going to give me a mood. It's going to affect my mood, and that my mood is going to give me a boost. It's going to enhance how strong I can charge my subconscious when using the main charging technique, right? So that's basically the general principle and the idea of deep charging. Now, to actually perform the deep charge, very simple. You would simply keep main charging over the course of 7 days, over the course of a rolling 7-day period. And when I say a rolling 7-day period, basically all that means is wherever your last charge was. So if I charge on a Tuesday, basically from there, my deep charge is going to consist of how much I charge over the next 7 days until that next Tuesday, right? So it's not like a calendar 7 days, right? It's not like if I deep charge at Saturday, if I start charging on Saturday at 11 o'clock, right? As soon as it hits Sunday, I lose all my charge. Or if I keep charging Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, but it's Sunday, then I lose everything I did because it's a new calendar week. That doesn't mean, obviously the calendar date means nothing, right? So I just say a rolling 7-day period that begins from wherever your last charge was. If I charge on a Tuesday, then my deep charge in my was stored in my subconscious short-term memory. I basically can monitor it across the next 7 days until that next Tuesday. And that'll contribute to my deep charge. In other words, deep charging will be relative to the last 7 days, right? Or you can focus on it in terms of the next 7 days. So it's just basically a rolling 7-day period. You would always compare it to some reference point of either 7 days before or 7 days after. But I generally like to just do it. I'd like to think of it in terms of what you're going to do the next 7 days, because that's what it means to deep charge, right? So if I want to deep charge the inner peace frequency, right, I would start off with a main charge. I might pre-charge for a day or two, then start main charging it. I might main charge for, a couple, like I said, depends on how much I pre-charge, but I might main charge for about 30 seconds to a minute. And then I might have multiple sessions like that throughout the day. And then I keep expanding the time more and more and more. I might go to 3 minutes or 4 minutes if I feel the need to. And each time I do this over the course of each day, I'm actually going to feel it in my mood more and more and more. And so this is actually important because this is a phenomenon I think most people don't realize it's happening. I didn't know this was happening even when I was charging and using charging techniques. I didn't really know that well how to charge back then before I realized this was happening. But still, I was still making an effort to charge. And I didn't notice that when I would keep charging day after day after day, that would enhance my ability to charge later. It was much easier to charge later when I kept doing it day after day. It's hard to notice it, right? But if you know this principle, you don't have to try to consciously watch it. You just recognize it's going to happen, and it's always happened. So this is I'm used to this now. It's a very basic process. I don't need to consciously kind of watch it. I just know it's going to happen, and it always does, right? So the more I charge each day, the more the effect accumulates in my short-term memory. And I notice I start to have an easier and easier time. And my subconscious becomes more volatile to some frequency, to the frequency that I'm charging. I feel it in my mood more. It's much easier for me to enter a transcendental state. It's much easier for me to charge at emotion and for my subconscious to switch to the frequency reflected in my deep charge. And so it just gets easier and easier and easier to charge some subconscious frequency as you keep charging it over the course of a 7-day period. And so basically that's what it means to deep charge, right? And so if I keep doing, let's say I keep charging inner peace frequency day after day, and I keep expanding the sessions longer and longer and longer, like I said, I'm going to notice, like I said, that it's becoming easier to charge. So now what's important to also recognize about a deep charge is ideally, right? So this is the ideal. It's not very realistic, but ideally, if you wanted to perform the perfect deep charge, right, over the course of a 7-day period, you would make it so that your short-term memory only has the frequency that you want, because then you're going to get the maximum boosting power of your mood, right? And you're going to be able to perform the most intense kind of main charge possible. So in other words, what that would mean is that you would have to produce only one kind of intention. It can't switch to any other frequency, or you can't produce intention that causes your subconscious to go to any other frequency but the one that you want to charge. And then you would have to maintain that, keep your intention on that frequency, or expressing that type of command, for a whole 7-day period, or a rolling 7-day period. And you are not allowed to do anything else, and you have to keep entering a transcendental state during that time. So obviously that's very unrealistic, right? That's why I put it here. It's unrealistic to maintain the intentional integrity over a 7-day period. Obviously, we're adults, we live in the real world. There will obviously be many times that we focus on something that causes us to produce a negative intention. There will be times when we're stressed out. There will be effects that our body has on our subconscious, right? There will be all types of things that we experience and things that are negative, right? And at any time you basically see something that's negative, let's say you're watching the news and the news is negative. What happens? You focus on the news, you hold some intention for about 7 to 10 seconds while you're watching it, you enter a transcendental state. If the news is telling you something that's negative, due to reflection principle, you're going to also charge up at some negative frequency. That charge is going to stay in your subconscious short-term memory for 7 days, right? Or up to 7 days. And so the more negative things, let's say I focus on lots of negative things. I'm at work. I argue with a whole bunch of people, right? Now I'm charging negative energy from that, right? I watch a scary movie. That's negative. I charge up at a negative frequency. I listen to terrible music, right? So I listen to music that talks about drugs and alcohol and things like that. That causes my subconscious to charge at a negative frequency. And so if I keep exposing myself to things that cause me, through the reflection principle, to produce a negative intention and charge at a negative frequency, that's going to make, now ideally I want to charge at a positive frequency, right? So if I keep focusing on things that cause my subconscious to charge at a negative frequency, that's going to dampen my ability to charge a positive frequency. So when you're deep charging, you actually have to watch what you're focused on. this was something, I never really consumed much negative things anyway, but this was something that I noticed I had to do. So this is very important, right? Because every time you charge, even if it's a little thing, right? Every time you charge over the course of a 7-day period, that energy sticks around. It sticks around and stays in your subconscious short-term memory. And the more you do it, the more it grows. It's going to start impacting your mood, and it's going to start dampening your ability to charge the positive frequency you actually want to feel. You cannot get to a higher level of charge without focusing on these components, right? So I can't just listen to terrible music or negative music, watch really negative movies, argue with people or fight people, or constantly focus on stories that make my subconscious charge negatively, and then say, oh, I want to perform a main technique to charge a positive emotion. Like, no, right? It doesn't work like that. So all that negative emotion that in activities that you engaged in over the course of a 7-day period, the energy from it sticks around. It's going to dampen your main charge. If you want a deep charge, right, you have to actually engage in positive activities, right? Now, so in other words, if I want to charge a positive frequency like inner peace, I got to make sure I'm not focusing on negative things throughout the 7-day period, right? And if you already have, by the time you start charging, so that's the prior 7 days, then you can expect that the energy from that prior 7 days, all that negative energy, is going to dampen the main charging technique when you perform it for the first time, right? On that, I guess, the 7th day or the 8th day. But as you keep charging day after day after day, and you actually do start paying attention to what you're focused on, and you make sure you don't focus on things that cause you to charge a negative frequency, then all of the positive memory that has that negative frequency is going to start to age out day after day after day. And each time as each memory ages out, you're going to notice that you're feeling more and more and more positive. You're feeling more of that inner peace frequency and all the lingering frequencies of the other positive things that you started focusing on. You want to make sure you focus on positive things. Now, even if you're focusing on positive things, generally they're not really going to have anywhere near at least those subconscious memories aren't going to have anywhere near the amount of energy that the subconscious memory associated with the subject that you're focusing on when you're charging. It's not going to have anywhere near the amount of energy that memory has, because you're actually charging with it, right? So that'll just be way, way beyond the amount of energy generally of the subconscious memories that are just associated with stuff you've been focused on throughout the day. So, but those memories are still important because they add to your mood. They have an effect on your short-term memory and the ambience of your mood, and they can still boost your main charging technique, right? But the main boost is going to come from the fact that you kept main charging over the course of a 7-day period, which I state here. So yeah, and I pretty much already went over this point, but so when you're deep charging, you want to be cognizant of the activities and patterns of thought that cause the subconscious to charge at negative frequencies, and this will dampen a positive frequency charge. So I already said that. But one thing that this does remind me of is also self-talk, right? So your patterns of thought. If you keep thinking negative thoughts, even about yourself, like, I can't do this, or they're going to hate me, or no one's going to like me, something like that, that causes your subconscious to charge at a negative frequency. And that actually builds up and adds over time in your subconscious short-term memory. So even thoughts like that are going to dampen your charge. So any positive charge, if you want to charge at a positive frequency, you have to sort of have a pattern of thinking, and that's going to be reflected by both your activities and even the type of media you consume, right? Basically things you observe, you choose to focus on throughout your day. All of it has to be positive, right? There's no shortcuts here. So you're not going to be able to feel these higher levels of intensity, of emotional intensity for a positive frequency, but not apply it in your pattern of thought and what you choose to consume, right, in terms of media and activities you engage in. So yeah, let's say you want to deep charge the inner peace frequency, you would do the main charging. Let's actually say that you were charging a whole bunch of negative emotions of anger, you were arguing with people, you had negative self-talk, you kept thinking that you're such a terrible person, you were listening to horrible music related to drugs and alcohol and sex and things like that. So your your short-term memory has a lot of negative, positive memories in it. Well, that sounds weird, but what I mean is, it has a lot of positive memories that have a negative frequency stored in them. The energy in them has a negative frequency. So your mood is very negative from all of those negative experiences. In a sense, that's not exactly a deep charge, but the ambience of your mood is very negative, and it's dampening any main charge at a positive frequency. So let's say that I start now main charging some positive frequency. I use the main charging technique. I charge inner peace. I cut all of that garbage out of my life in terms of the negative music and movies. I stop the negative self-talk. I stop arguing with people or hanging out with people who are negative, who I perceive in a negative way. And then I start focusing on positive things. So I start listening to more peaceful music. I start watching positive TV and listening to other kinds of positive music after peaceful music. I start engaging in positive activities. Each one of these activities in these types of media are causing my conscious mind, through the reflection principle, to produce an intention that causes my subconscious to switch to a positive frequency. And what ends up happening is I keep storing more and more positive energy in my short-term subconscious memory. And as I keep doing that, now I'm getting as I keep doing that in conjunction with doing the main charging technique day after day after day in multiple short sessions, what's going to end up happening is now my subconscious memory is going to start to feel filled out with positive emotions, with the most intense one being the inner peace frequency, because that's the one I'm main charging. So you're going to notice your mood is becoming more positive, and it's going to be a mixture of different emotions, but you're going to notice the most intense one, and most intense feeling in your mood is going to be the inner peace frequency. And then when you perform a main charging technique, let's say you do that for 7 days. When you perform a main charging technique later and focus on some subject, right, related or category related to the your main charge, you're going to notice how volatile your subconscious becomes, because not only are you in the mood for it like crazy, but when you start main charging, you're going to notice a huge boost in intensity of when you enter a transcendental state and feel that inner peace emotion while you're in that state too. You're going to feel it even more intensely. So that basically is it. So that's what it means to deep charge, right? Just basically keep performing the main charging technique over the course of a 7-day period. Over that 7-day period, your mood is going to increase, and it's going to reflect the frequency of your main charge. And you're going to be your main charging technique is going to feel more and more and more intense, or the experience of when you're main charging is going to feel more and more intense when you do that. And then you just need to be cognizant of the things you're paying attention to and you're observing during that 7-day period. You generally want to focus on more positive things during that time and cut out focusing on things that cause your subconscious to switch to a negative frequency. If you just do that, you're going to deep charge, and if you basically keep doing that week after week or 7-day period after 7-day period, your subconscious is going to deep charge more and more and more and more. And so one last thing, which I forgot to write here, is when you get the hang of deep charging, it can be very, very, very powerful, right? And so you can reach levels of charge that are so intense, right, that it might actually start to be, what's the word I want to look for? It might start to be almost a bad thing in a way. Because like I said, positive memory, it has the effect on your thoughts of making your mind sort of race, right? Not really in like an anxious kind of way, but you're just constantly thinking, right? Your mind is in motion because your subconscious is compelling you very strongly to think thoughts related to the frequency of your charge, right? So your mind isn't still. Your perception also becomes altered. So it can kind of distort your view of reality and your ability to sort of function normally in reality. We'll actually talk a little bit more about that in chapter 14, but even the inner peace frequency. Now you might think it's a good thing to charge the inner peace frequency to really high levels, but there's actually a problem with that, right? If I charge the feeling of peace to really, really, really intense levels, my perception is going to be so distorted by that charge. In other words, I'm going to see the world, I'm going to think so peacefully, right? I'm going to feel so peaceful that it's actually not very beneficial for being a productive member of society, right? We'll talk a little more about that in chapter 15, but just to give an example, right? Let's say I get fired from my job or something, right? I won't even react to that strongly because I feel so much peace, right? My perception is too altered to properly assess what's going on. I'm just going to feel inner peace, and I'll be like, whatever happens, I'll be okay. And I just feel, I sort of lean into that feeling of calmness and comfort, right, and tranquility, right? That's not a good thing. You're not going to be able to solve all your problems and deal with the problems of the world by being peaceful, right? Sometimes you need to be a little more aggressive, a little more anxious, a little more, thinking just in a different way, right? So, and we'll talk a little more about that later, but in chapter 14. But you don't want to deep charge too far, right? It's just not going to be a good thing. And plus, your mind's going to be kind of racing too much, right? And it's going to be hard to keep it still, so you can use logic and rationality and reason, which comes from your negative mind, to properly assess what's going on, make future plans, things like that. This is going to kind of keep your mind, excuse me, if you deep charge too far, it's almost going to keep your mind in like a dreamlike state. And it's just going to become harder to function normally in life. And so you don't want to deep charge too far. Like I said, if your subconscious memory, short-term memory becomes too positive, that's bad, and if it becomes too negative, that's bad. You want to have a nice sort of balance between the two. You want it to be definitely more positive than negative, but not too much more positive than negative, right? So like it's like your blood, right? So your blood could be more alkaline or more acidic, right? You want it to definitely be a little more alkaline, but not too much more alkaline, right? Still, even though alkaline's a little bit better, it still will kill you, right? If you go way too far into alkalinity. So subconscious memory is the same thing, right? So yeah, that's pretty much it. Like I said, just practice this. Pick some frequency, right? Practice deep charging it according to all these principles, and then you're gonna know exactly what I'm talking about. And when you start deep charging some emotion, and you reach really, really, really high levels of intensity, then you're going to start, everything we've been talking about is going to really come home, right? And you're going to really get the hang of controlling your subconscious in the post-new phase. So when something isn't new anymore, you're going to start to get the hang of all the principles involved in actually controlling your subconscious in a way that doesn't correspond to the exception. It's actually the rule, right? So yeah, that's how you deep charge. This is the last video of this chapter. In chapter 12, we're gonna start talking about different principles involved in charging. So kind of slightly more advanced principles that we didn't go over in this chapter. I just want to give you a basic rundown of how the charging process works. Like I said, the whole book is kind of built up to these principles, and I think it probably wasn't too bad because you had all those principles. There's a lot I didn't have to explain, right, to kind of explain these things. In my earlier books, right, the earlier versions of the book, there were 4 versions. When I always started talking about how to charge in chapter 7, right? So now we do it in chapter 11, because at that time I didn't understand principles about positive and negative memory, right? Or I talked a little bit about transcendental states. I didn't understand that much either. I didn't know that you had to enter a transcendental state to charge, because that's the only way you could do it, but I didn't really understand a lot of principles about it. I refined the ideas way more. And I didn't break up the chapter on the body into 3 chapters at the time, because that also expanded. But anyway, I usually talked about by chapter 7, and there were way more ideas I had to talk about because, I tried to incorporate them into chapter 7, including what we're going to talk about in chapter 13, which is a huge chapter. And in that time, I didn't really understand how to charge in that way. So, but yeah, like I said, these principles probably a little bit easier to understand because of everything we went over. But there's still a few more things to talk about, and we're going to talk about that in chapter 12. So there's slightly more advanced principles, but I don't think it should be too bad. Right, so yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.